When I was in high school, I remember my physics techs taking a trip to Six Flags in by Chicago for their physics day. Of course, we didn't do a whole lot of math that day. We spent most of our day riding the rides. I got stuck with a group of girls that day, and most of the day, actually, I spent holding their purses and their stuff as they went on the rides. That was okay, though. I don't really enjoy riding theme park rides. I don't know why. It just doesn't really tickle my fancy, I guess, or something. Case in point, though, about liking rides. They had encouraged and persuaded me to go on a roller coaster ride at one point. I never been on one before, and I absolutely hated it. And it wasn't even the big ones. It was still considered underneath the family rides. It wasn't the like the Superman or something like that. It scared me to death as I was on it. And I know many people spend hours and hours in line for that thrill, the excitement of the fear of the drops and the speed and the legs dangling, whatever it might be, and then that fear that they have, but then immediately after that, the delight of the experience that they've been through. I was reading a portion from Psalm 112 today. Verse 1 says this. It says, "Praise the Lord, how blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in his commands." Fear and delight. Now, it's not the same, of course, as the roller coaster rides. It's different here, but it gives us a starting point. Fearing the Lord is a common phrase used throughout the scriptures. In fact, in the New American Standard, it's mentioned, that phrase in some form with those words is mentioned over 60 times. Solomon says this in Proverbs, first chapter. He says that the beginning of wisdom is what? To fear the Lord. Now, in the Old Testament, that phrase is basically synonymous with a proper living or righteous living, obedience. Those things all go hand in hand when they talk about fearing the Lord. Fearing God does not speak it does sometimes, but not always does it speak of this shaking terror before the Lord. Now, of course, we can't be mistaken. That's probably an element of it. In fact, in many respects, God is terrifying. In fact, we probably have too little of that aspect at times. God is holy. He is majestic. He is especially frightening, opposed to everything that is unholy and would seek to diminish His glory. And so we can't take God lightly. We can never do that. But at the same time, to fear in God in most contexts means to worship Him. It talks about obeying Him. It talks about honoring and trusting Him. A person who honors, trusts, worships, obeys the Lord, the psalmist says, is blessed, is happy, is in a state of joy. I'm sure you remember that from Psalm 1 as well. How blessed is the man who does not do this, this, and this, but walks righteously. And I love the word delight here. And it means just what you think it means. It means to take pleasure in. I was thinking this afternoon about that word delight, and asking the question about what do I delight in? I delight in my family. I delight in preaching. I delight in mowing the yard and doing some things with the tractor. I delight in fishing. And if I asked you that question, or you asked yourself that question right now, I'm sure you would very easily be able to list some things off the top of your head about what you delight in. What do you find pleasure in? The question that we have to ask is this, especially as I was reading these verses here, is that do I find greater pleasure in those things than in the Lord? And your answer to that is important. Because if you are finding pleasure in those things, whatever it might be, fill in the blank here with whatever your is, above the Lord, then I think that you'll find that you don't fear Him as you should. Those things, if you will, have cornered the market of our heart. And we find pleasure in them rather than in the Lord. Right now, of course, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's been an uptick in viewing online church services, not just by believers, but by those who wouldn't normally darken the door of a church as well. People in general in the midst of crises are more spiritually sensitive. We see that pattern throughout our nation often. We see that after September 11th with the hijackers and the planes and the attacks. We've seen it at various other points in our history. In the midst of major crises, people generally are more spiritually sensitive. But given time, people often revert back to their own ways. God is simply a crutch they use for the time to get through that hardship. My prayer is this, is that we would never treat the Lord as simply a crutch. My prayer is that we would fear Him, that we would have that reverent love, that we would understand the greatness of who He is, and that would motivate us to trust Him, to honor Him, to worship and obey Him at all times in our lives. And we should take and find delight in Him, not just on Sundays, not just in a song, but every single day, every moment of our lives, especially in the midst of crises, yes, but in every other moment as well. Fearing and delighting in Him, arrive in a blessed, happy state as He calms our fears, as He brings peace to our hearts and minds, as we experience His grace, as we see Him at work. The psalmist says this, he says, "How blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in His commands." The question to answer today is this: do we fear the Lord, and do we delight in Him? Your answers to that are important. God bless.